educational games and what I've learned, what my team's learned over the last 12 or 13 years in this space. Just to give you a little bit of context, you'll see the Cogniss branding there. This is not a sales pitch for Cogniss, but I can't really talk about what we've learned without talking about the platform we created and why we created it. I've been in this space for a very long time. Games developer in the 1980s, believe it or not, and moved into EdTech around 99. And in 2004, I founded a business unit inside a large agency group, specifically looking at how we could use digital channels for changing behaviour and for delivering on complex educational outcomes. And that business became 2 and 2, and we became an independent company in 2008. And over the years running 2 and 2, the team and I here had the privilege of getting to work on some of the biggest educational games as well as gamification projects in the Australian market. A lot of work working with government, working with the Commonwealth Education Department. We made over 1,000 deliverables, different sorts of games and things for the Learning Federation that went into the K-12 school system. Lots of adult learning, lots of things in the mental health space and general health, really looking at learning from a cognitive perspective and how we deliver that sort of long-term behaviour change as well. And in doing that, we had some great experiences and a lot of fun, and we got to do these massive projects that won awards around the world. I think one of our distinctions was winning over 50 awards around the world, which I think is just about more than anyone in this space. And yet we were constantly frustrated, and we were frustrated by how difficult it was to do these sorts of game-based projects. They're difficult for our clients to engage with us, difficult for us in terms of how we could run the projects. They required very big budgets, long lengths of time. And basically around 2015, we started thinking about how to productize what we'd learned. And what I'll do is I'm just going to take you through some very high-level case studies of some of these things that we did at 2 and 2, and just give you some insights into the sort of good, bad, and the ugly, and what we learned about educational games, sort of pioneering these in the digital realm. So just to set the context, we've got gamification in the title, and there's always a bit of confusion between educational games and gamification, and we work in both. So to us, an educational game is a game that is there to involve you and educate you in a certain subject, as opposed to gamification, whereas gamification is really about taking something that is not a game and applying game mechanics as a way of incenting people to engage with the educational material and move through. So the two things are quite separate. We started off really as an educational games company. When we saw the gamification revolution happen around 2013, we were a bit skeptical about it initially, because we felt that a lot of what was being done, particularly in gamification of adult learning, lacked any strong psychological basis. It was all about giving people badges and rewards that often weren't, very well designed. Nevertheless, we started to move into gamification ourselves, and you'll see some of that in these case studies. So for us, what we think about with gamification is how can we create something that moves someone from looking at intrinsic motivations or extrinsic motivations to intrinsic motivations. So basically, we always want to leverage people's intrinsic motivations. We want them to want to engage with the game or with the learning content and complete that. But what gamification allows you to do is to also provide those rewards and those extrinsic motivators. But really, we want to think about those extrinsic motivators in terms of how we can leverage those to move people on the path to ultimately being intrinsically motivated to complete the education. Now, the sorts of typical bad things that we've seen a lot in gamification is points for point's sake without any really good design behind them, no link between the contents and rewards, so just badgification, offering badges for particular things without there being any deeper reward. Things like leaderboards, there are a few circumstances under which they can be used properly, but generally we hate them because leaderboards tend to engage high achievers and disengage everyone else. You know, think about it in a K-12 situation. If you're using a leaderboard with school children, the top 5 kids in the class will be really motivated by the leaderboard. The bottom 10 are being told all the time that they're no good, and they will disengage with the learning. So a lot of these things are quite dangerous to use. Likewise, competition. Competition needs to be used in a way that it provides positive reinforcement and just doesn't demotivate people because they're not winning the competitions. Whereas on the other side, good practice really involves linking the theoretical and the applied learning. You know, we want to use games to really put applied learning at the centre of what we're doing. We want to reward things like perseverance. We always talk about growth mindset and think about how to integrate growth mindset into what we're doing. So we want to create grit. We want people to be engaged to continue and to persevere. Competition can be used well, but it needs to be used in a way that drives the outcome that you want. So often we look at how to drive competition that rewards groups for achieving behaviour. How do you get one person to encourage someone to do something rather than the competition becoming a discouragement? And what we want to do is put the psychology of behaviour at the centre of what we do. So an example of that is I talked a bit about badgification. Badges for badges' sake don't serve much purpose apart from a record of doing the learning. But give people a reward when they're not expecting it, and that will release the dopamine that really reinforces the experience as being a positive experience. And that's what we really want to think about with gamification. It is about dopamine release, which leads to strong neural pathways, which leads to established and repeated behaviours. So done right, that can be very powerful. Now, looking at some of the projects that we did, probably the biggest one was the language learning space. So the language learning space is the game-based repository for all Asian language learning for the K-12 system. So this is Mandarin, Japanese, and Bahasa Indonesia. And the background to this was really interesting because the Education Department and Education Services Australia came to us and said, look, we've got all of these educational resources available to language teachers, digital resources. The quality of them varies, you know, everything from PDFs to simple games, but not necessarily cutting edge. But they're there, they work when they're used properly. We can't get teachers to use them, and we have even more problems getting students to use them. So what we did was design this game-based system for rewarding the use of these learning objects. And basically, this screen here is from the Chinese language learning space. What we do is we have a game where basically you're on an adventure, you're a special agent traveling around China, and what you've got to do is save some antiquities, and to do that, you have to apply some language learning. And so what we did was give the Education Department a system whereby they could create learning journeys using their existing digital resources, and completion by the students of those digital resources would lead to unlocking a chapter of this game. So that is gamification in itself, gamifying this experience of doing something that is not a game, but putting that game-based reward around it. And then when they unlock that reward, they got to participate in one chapter of this adventure. Hugely successful. It actually opened our eyes to gamification because we were all about the learning games and not the gamification before this, but it worked beautifully. We found that students typically wanted to play the game so badly, they would just sort of jump ahead and try going into the games, but of course they weren't able to proceed through the games without acquiring the necessary vocabulary, which would force them to go back and do the perhaps slightly more boring learning journeys. And yeah, had massive success, was taken up by apparently close to 100% of Mandarin teachers in Australia and about 50% of Japanese and Bahasa Indonesia teachers. Another interesting project was ABC Zoom. So some of you who work in the education space might remember that the ABC launched something called ABC Splash a few years ago. ABC Splash was really an attempt to make digital resources more available for use in schools, as well as you know, video resources and things that the ABC had. And we created a couple of different games for them to help launch that. And one of those was ABC Zoom, and this was a really challenging project. This is a flipped classroom model, an adventure game that's designed to introduce 14-year-olds to different areas of physics, chemistry, and biology to engage them more deeply in the classroom setting. So basically, kids can go home and are instructed to go and play this game. It's a big immersive game where they learn applied science in these different areas on this space quest, and then come back into the classroom and basically then start a conversation about what they learned through the game. So it's not the complete learning resource, but it gets kids over that initial resistance they might have to science learning. It was really interesting being in testing for this game, because you'll get comments from kids constantly at the end of the game, oh wow, you just tricked me into doing some science. So it worked really well, but some of the interesting challenges that we had in the creation of this is getting the client to really understand their audience. So this is quite typical of doing projects where you're perhaps working with a government agency or a larger group, where the people who are backing the project are not typical of your audience. So it's very hard perhaps for older executives at the ABC to understand how 14-year-olds engage with games. And in fact, in this game, there was a lot of, in the development of this, there was a lot of frustration around the fact that at the time, Mark Scott was CEO of the ABC, and we kept hearing, well, Mark's got to be able to play this game. And it's slightly ridiculous to be designing a game to please an executive in their mid-50s when the game is intended for 14-year-olds. So those sorts of learnings about really focusing on your audience are absolutely key. Understanding what your audience likes and understanding what you think they might engage with might not be what they engage with at all. And the main way to deal with that is really in your design process, to make sure that you can engage and test your designs with the audience. Another example of the same thing. So the RAC in Western Australia, we've built lots of games for them around road safety education for kids. And this particular game that you're looking at here is aimed at preschool children. And it's a free play type game. If you've ever played with Tokaboka or things of that nature, it's like that. So it's a sort of game where nothing happens until you start interacting with the iPad. And children love it. You know, a 5-year-old will sit there in front of this game, bang away at the iPad, and they will work out how to play the game. Of course, put the same game in front of an adult, and they sit there waiting for the instructions, and they don't know what to do. So again, it required a lot of marketplace education to convince stakeholders at the RAC, to convince teachers and principals at schools that just because they couldn't play this game, the 5-year-olds would be able to play it. And yeah, eventually we got it out there, and they absolutely loved it. One of the things to remember with kids is they love autonomy. So games that put them in control are far more effective than games that are didactic and step them through the learning. Let them explore, let them find things for themselves, let them encounter a piece of information and have experiences and realize how those things apply in the real world. That will have a much deeper learning effect than delivering them some information and just having a little game to test that. slightly older audience here. Power Play is a mobile game aimed at apprentice tradies to teach them about energy efficiency in the home. This was funded by the federal government, and we built it with Skillset, who are a registered training organisation in Western New South Wales. And, you know, a really tough brief. We've got to get these young, mostly male tradies to engage with a message around energy efficiency. These are guys who, when we did the research on them, what was the thing they valued the most? They valued their ute more than anything. So they're not the sort of people who think about how they can reduce their environmental footprint in the world. Anyway, we created this game where, in a post-apocalyptic world, they have to bring a town back to life, and it happens that the town looks a hell of a lot like Orange, so that they could relate to it. And game was immensely successful, and actually went on to win the Australian Mobile Game of the Year, which is kind of incredible for a educational game. But it was really interesting, a really interesting experiment for us in looking at intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators. So for Skillset, the registered training organisation rolling this out, they had to get these student tradies to play this. They also wanted to learn from the student tradies basically whether they were reducing their energy consumption in the home. And they came to an arrangement with the local energy network company that they would be able to monitor people's energy consumption if the students brought back in their NMI, the number from their home electricity meter. And they offered $50 to every student to bring this number in. None of them did it. They increased it to $100. None of them did it. They just didn't get around to filling out this number. And yet, they went and played the game. They played the game in droves. And anecdotally, what we found from surveying the students afterwards is that many of them made pretty major changes around their home. They went to the local hardware store and bought energy efficient devices and things to, insulate and things of that nature. But, couldn't motivate them to go and get a number with a cash reward. And I thought this was just really interesting because it shows how an intrinsic reward, actually wanting to do this and actually learning from the game why the energy efficiency is important, drove a behavioural outcome. But the extrinsic reward of offering cash didn't achieve anything. So that really is where educational games come in as far as I'm concerned. It's about looking at that challenge not only to educate, but to actually motivate the learner to be engaged with the educational content. Some of the things that I've learned over the years, what I often see in the emergent educational games world is the well-meaning educator or teacher and the well-meaning software developer who think they can get together and build a good educational game. Not very likely to work. Unfortunately, educational games, to make them effective, it's much more complicated than that, and you really need an understanding of games design, learning experience design, and the psychology and neuropsychology of learning and how it happens through digital devices, or you need a way to get access to that expertise. Obviously, boring games, there's so many out there. Games that lack any strong educational basis. In the early days of the sort of boom of educational games, we saw a lot of maths learning games and things of that nature that really didn't teach any maths. All they were was kind of drill and kill learning exercises. And those things kind of have a place, but don't confuse that with proper education. As I've already touched on, not applying the correct neuropsychological principles. And then one of the big things that I see as bad practice now that you can say that we were always guilty of with a lot of the games that we built was the lack of scalability and sustainability. So all those projects you saw before, they were all good practice in terms of not having any of those other bad practice items that I've listed, but they were all poor in terms of their long-term sustainability. Because they were so complex and so expensive, it meant maintenance was expensive. And typically what we've seen on many of these projects is that they have a funding window, they go live, thousands of people use them while they're funded, and then when the funding window runs out, the server gets switched off and the thing has no life. And so for this, that's been a real, I guess, bugbear for us, is how to solve that problem, how to make these things cost-effective and maintainable. On the other hand, when we look at good practice, the sorts of things we want to see is formative assessment through the learning experience. This is one of the things that games are great for. You don't have to have a game to educate a student and then give them a test. If the game is designed well, they will be learning as they're playing, and you will be assessing that learning as it's occurring. And that continual formative assessment is so powerful, both in measuring how good your product is and in measuring students' progress. I touched on autonomy before. Having experiences that allow people to explore, to have their own pathway through the learning, to have their own sense of achievement, really key. And when you look at games in the entertainment space that are successful, most often they're ones that give the player a lot of autonomy. Look at the neuropsychology and how that can be applied. So the things we think about are things like flow. How can you get someone in that optimal zone where they're in a state of flow and they just want to keep playing the game and progressing through? And the key to that is really around having things at the correct difficulty level. Just hard enough to challenge without being too hard. And this is what, you know, good games do generally, not just educational games. You want to think about how you're driving long-term retention, how you're motivating and bringing the learner back so that they continue and that they develop some resilience. I was just reading at lunchtime today a psychologist talking about how she sees the biggest behavioural challenge that parents and teachers face with children today is that they're so used to instant gratification, they don't know how to experience delayed gratification. Games are really good for this. The idea that you don't get an outcome straight away, that you have to work hard, that you have to come back, that you have to keep going, and, you know, it's not all rewards straight away. Some of the bad games that I've seen in the educational space are the ones that give really poor feedback. You know, every time you do something, you get told, wow, you're great, fantastic. Those things aren't good. They don't create psychologically strong learners. They don't motivate the type of behaviour that you want, you know, to get educational success. What you want is something that gives honest feedback and rewards hard work and perseverance. And that's really where games come in, you know, helping take something that may seem boring, difficult, hard, and making it enjoyable while still being difficult and challenging. Social learning. Games are great if you can involve a social aspect. You know, we talked before about how competition done the wrong way can be a negative impact, but things where people can share their achievements, motivating each other, in the same way they do in the offline world, are great to leverage in the online world too. And as I've talked about before, it needs to be scalable and sustainable. You need to be able to know that you can update what you've created and build on it over time without spending a fortune. So a wise person once said, to learn and not to do is not to learn. And, you know, we learned from the good things we did and we learned from the mistakes. And about 5 years ago, we started research and development into how we could productize the creation of effective educational games. And 3 years ago, we kind of flipped our business and launched Cogniss. And we refer to Cogniss as human transformation technology. And the reason we talk about it as human transformation technology and not education technology is we think people tend to, when you talk about EdTech, they tend to think about the delivery of content and the assessment of learning. And those things are important and we do those things too, but that's not really the power of this type of tool. Now, what is really the power of this type of tool is the ability to rewire someone's brain, to get them to commit to a particular practice, a particular behaviour, and achieve a long-term learning outcome. And the way that we describe human transformation technology is we think it's a huge category that already exists. People haven't put the name to it yet, but you can see it there. If you go into the Apple App Store or you go into Google Play, look at some of the top apps in there. Here we've got the #1 app for language learning in Duolingo, #1 mental health app in Headspace, #1 physical fitness app in Sweat, and #1 brain training app with Peak. Most people would look at those apps and say, well, those apps are completely different. They serve completely different purposes. And we look at them and say, no, actually, they're all the same. It's just their content and the learning outcome they're driving is different. These apps all have thousands of direct competitors, and they absolutely dominate their markets. And the reason that they dominate their markets is that they've applied the neuropsychology of how you engage someone in a repetitive activity really, really well. So if you want to learn a language, you need to engage with that activity regularly. You need to practice the things that are hard, that make your brain work and that make you remember. Duolingo does that really well. Headspace does the same thing for meditation. You know, a lot of people know they want to meditate, but they need something to motivate them to do it. Headspace does that. Sweat does that around physical fitness, and Peak does that around brain training. And when we look at the elements they have in those apps, they're the exact same elements that we built into our own platform. So with Cogniss, we've productized everything from what is the best experience to have on a mobile device or a web browser for particular learning and behavioural activities. We template the different types of interactions that you can have, and then we have artificial intelligence for populating the content into those templates. Now, what does that mean? I'll drill down into that a little bit more. So when we talk about templates, I talked before about how very bespoke educational games are not very sustainable. They're so expensive to make, they're so expensive to maintain, and so they tend to have a limited life. What we thought about very hard was how do you separate the content from the form? How can you have really good game-based experiences that suit different types of subject matter and allow different types of learning to occur? So we've created a whole suite of templates around these different types of learning activities, not just games, but including games. And then we have a system that allows creators of EdTech game-based solutions to create their own little games and drop them inside our system. And those games can be anything from, you know, a simple text-based game or interactive video to augmented or virtual reality or 3D games. And then we have different artificial intelligence engines that control how we insert content into those games. So this allows that separation of content from form. So new content can continually be created by the app owner over time and populated into their app without re-engineering the underlying games. And those AI engines do a variety of different things. So we have something called the Cognition engine. Now, a minute ago, I was talking about Duolingo and how good Duolingo is at getting you to do the hard work of language learning. Well, the Cognition engine is a productized version of that approach to learning. So it knows when to give the learner a particular item to learn, what difficulty the learner is at, how to optimize that difficulty. We talk about Goldilocks leveling, not too difficult, not too hard, so that the leveling is in that proximal zone, that zone that puts the player into a state of flow by challenging them just enough. And then we also do things in there like control when repetition occurs, allow for techniques. Some of you may have heard of things like interleading. So we facilitate that type of thing. I won't, there isn't time to go into that in detail, but let's just say what it's about is making the brain work hard without you feel like your brain is working hard. And this is what leads to the long-term neural pathways that ensure that the learning is understood and retained. The behaviour engine is kind of the secret sauce to how we motivate people. So this is an artificial intelligence engine that knows when is the right time to give someone a reward, when is the right time to send a message to their phone. It's that thing that allows the experience to be hyper-personalised, because the way we learn and what motivates us varies so much. So this is about varying the reward experience to get the optimum response. And then we have things like the content engine, which is for putting together more traditional learning, and the assessment engine. I talked before about how we like formative assessment, and the Cognition engine does formative assessment very well, but when people work with us and they want to do things in the formal education space, they often need summative assessment too, and the assessment engine is an easy way to do that. And then what we've done is productize all of those rewards that you need to help release the dopamine for the player. So all of those things that you might figure out, giving surprise rewards, unlocking pathways, sharing with your social network what you've achieved, incentivise and repeat use of the app. All of those sorts of things are handled in the reward centre. And then we have the usual sorts of things you would expect in a game-based system. We have coins and experience points, the ability to give people vouchers and things of that nature. A single user identity, this is really powerful. So for people who are building EdTech game businesses where they want to have a suite of apps and they want to be able to track one learner across those apps, having that single user identity allows for that. It also means that that learner can take their achievements from one app to the next. They can take their friends, they can take their teams and their social relationships. And we have this underlying social network that people use in some apps and not in others, but this allows you, to have those relationships, share things to walls, do all those collaborative, positive reinforcement things that we want to happen in a social learning environment. Obviously, there's no point in having a great learning experience if you aren't reporting on it. So, we've thought about all of those sort of dashboards and what is the type of analysis that you need. So we provide analysis around where people are on their learning journey, as well as all of those responses to individual interactions, how long those things took, so that you can look at a group, you can look at an individual, you can see how the learning is occurring, and where there's a problem, you can really drill down to see what that problem is. And then the other thing that we do is relationship management. So this is that thing for, in the education setting, it's really for the teacher or the tutor, so that they can take notes about what's happening in the offline world. They can put offline data with online data. They can be alerted as to when a student is or isn't using the app, all that sort of thing. What do these sort of games look like? Well, they all look different, but how do we make the time matter? Okay, I'm just going to show you a short movie of one of the first apps that was built on Cogniss. This was called STEM Explorer Summer Learning. It's built by an Australian company, but for the US market, and its purpose is to address what they refer to as summer learning loss, the fact that kids tend to fall behind over their summer holidays and start the new year a couple of months behind where they were when they finished the previous year. I'll just let you watch this movie. Whoop. Let's go back. Play. It's going to play now. Okay, so that was really just giving you a taste of the sort of sophisticated apps that can be created using this platform. What was key for us, as I said, that was the first thing built on the platform. We were able to reduce the initial development costs by about 75% over what we used to charge clients to build something like that, you know, in a manual and bespoke way. But more than that, it's the fact that the owners of that app can now add to it, they can change content, they can do all that sort of stuff ongoing, and, you know, have that long-term longevity with the product. Just quickly, in terms of who's using it, you can see it's being used for everything from formal education with the Commonwealth Education Department to things like behaviour change in shopping centres with people like Veolia, and things related to the medical market with guys like Soho Floridas. One of the big things for us is that we do a lot in the research sector. So we have 5 universities we're currently working with. In fact, today it actually went up to 6. Sydney University's now in there as well, where we're producing Cogniss apps for them for the purpose of running research projects, because we're able to collect such granular data. You'll remember that earlier in this presentation I showed those top-selling consumer apps that all looked very different to each other, and I was saying how, well, to us, they're all the same thing. That's the same for these apps here. You can see here that the apps that have been produced to date on Cogniss vary enormously, from things like that STEM app you saw before, early literacy, creative education, to things like adult learning games around business simulations, and even things for treating mental health conditions like gambling disorders. All using the same tools, all using the same components, because essentially the brain is the brain is the brain. By using the correct design, we know we can always deliver these outcomes regardless of who the audience is or what the content is or what the app might look like. The look is really, you know, a rather superficial thing. It's the content and the personalization of the experience of the individual learner that's been key to the success of this. The other things that we're starting to do is, because we can have one idea across multiple apps, because we have a social network, we can start to look at relationships and how we involve things like families in the learning process. With that comes a certain amount of responsibility around data. So a key thing for us has been developing privacy policies and ways of managing privacy that are compliant with the different standards that are required around the world, and that really put the end user in charge of their data and how their data is used. Just quickly, I'm going to touch on some of the power of what we're seeing as being possible through learning games. One of the things we're really interested in is that through these types of educational games, you start to have this continual formative assessment on different learning domains. And so we see a world in the future where, from one child playing maybe a literacy game, a numeracy or STEM game, maybe doing something sports related, we can start to recognise different cognitive issues that may exist in different challenges. And so we're really interested in starting to work with people on the ideas of how can we pre-diagnose or see risk of cognitive issues like dyslexia, like ADHD, and recognise those things earlier, and then use the platform itself to allow personalised interventions to be created to help deal with those types of cognitive issues. Cogniss at the moment is a low-code platform, and that means that we work, or other developers work with clients to build on top of this platform, and it reduces development costs by about 75%. But I think possibly the exciting thing for people in this audience is that we're planning to release something called Cogniss Studio, hopefully in beta by March next year. We've been promising it for a while, but it's really happening now. And Cogniss Studio is going to be a free product where you can create your own educational games through a point-and-click interface and publish them out to a shared environment, basically. And drop me an email if you're interested in being on the beta list for that in March when it comes out next year. And sorry for making this a bit of a sales pitch. Really not meant to be, but it's hard for me to talk about our experience without talking about it in relation to the product we created and why we created it. So over to all of you. Does anyone have any questions I'd like to ask?
Oh, that's a good question, Leon. Can Cogniss be kind of integrated into something like a learning management system? Have you begun to look at something like that, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cogniss itself functions as its own kind of environment for tracking all that kind of data, but it's not an LMS in the traditional sense. We have a series of open APIs, so you can pull that data out and you can pretty much interface with anything else that has an API to it. So yeah, we've certainly got systems where people are going to be integrating it to HR systems, LMSs and things of that nature. And also Cogniss is, as you've seen, it solves a particular educational problem. It's not designed to be the be-all and end-all or to replace LMSs or the more sort of traditional content that you might deliver through those. And increasingly we're seeing people look at it as a way of doing companion apps, things that are designed to engage people, while the traditional LMS content is used for the more traditional learning approaches.
Hey Leon,
Cool.
Kernan Nicole
Thanks.
here from Grasshopper. Yeah, really cool seeing your work with Cogniss and 2 and 2. But yeah, one question that we have is, have you done integrations with things like different sorts of hardware or anything beyond just other sorts, screen-based stuff? I think because we're a startup that works in the hardware space and early learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're just interested to hear.
Yeah, so Cogniss itself is for pushing out apps, either native apps for iOS and Android, as well as responsive web apps. And then we have this series of APIs that allow us to not only push data out, but to pull data in. So if what we're seeing occurring, and we haven't had an opportunity to do a project like this, but there are several in the works, I think, over the next year, is look at things like wearables, but it could also be digital toys, anything that records data, we can bring that data in. So we want to, create holistic experiences. We don't want things that stand alone. So I'm not sure with Grasshopper what sort of devices you're using. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
So it's their tablet or smart screen based, but it's a hardware interface consisting of 4 silicon smart tiles that connect via Bluetooth to your device and have a bunch of sensors in them. So kids can basically jump around and be active while they're engaging with different sorts of games. And we're partnering with lots of different early learning centres in development around that.
Very, very cool. So, I'm personally all for that, things that get something environmental into the learning experience rather than being purely screen-based. As there's the opportunity for that to be far more effective. So there's 2 different ways potentially that something like that can be integrated. One is if you're already pulling the data back into a back end somewhere, then we can interface to that. The other is if you want to have games and activities that are using those blocks and real world devices inside a Cogniss app, then you can do that by building custom interactions. So you remember I talked about templates. So a template is really just like any sort of game or activity that can then be using an SDK we have dropped inside the experience. So I'm imagining something like that. We work with Unity, so
Awesome.
That's the sort of thing where you would tend to build a custom experience in Unity, little activities, and then drop them inside the Cogniss app, and you could still use AI engines for populating those with more content and having difficulty increase over time and things like that.
All right, well, thank you very much for your presentation, Leon. It was very insightful for me as someone who's kind of a new to gamification, learning games. So really appreciate your time and thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for coming. We've recorded this session, so if you feel someone in your team should watch it in the future, we'll be sending out email this and also the slides that Leon prepared for today. So thanks everyone for coming, and thank you very much to the team at Cogniss.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. It was a pleasure, and my apologies. I like doing these sorts of things with interactions and being able to see faces, so it's quite challenging to sit here and just drop all this information on you for 40 minutes or so. So anyone who found it a bit heavy going and would like to drill down and talk some more, leon@cogniss.com, just drop me an email and I'll set something up with you.
Great. Thanks, Leon.
Thanks. See you all.
Thanks, Leon. Thanks, Alex.